When studying the Garden of Eden in the Old Testament, it is hard to miss the allusions to the tabernacle and the temple. Well, okay, maybe it is easy to miss the allusions, but the original and early readers wouldn't have. Remember that Genesis had an original intended audience, so just stick with me here, okay? So when God created the Garden of Eden, he created it to be a primordial temple. And the first place we see this is actually through the 7 days of creation. When a temple was constructed in the ancient Near East, the use of the number 7 was a cultural symbol for temple inauguration. We see that throughout the Bible. The construction of the tabernacle was completed in 7 stages and had 7 furnishings. The ordination of a priest was 7 days long. Solomon's temple was constructed in 7 years and then dedicated to God during a 7-day festival in the 7th month. Solomon's dedication speech was given in 7 petitions. Even outside the Bible, you can find this as well. The Gudea Cylinder speaks of a 7-day temple dedication, and Ugaritic texts speak of Baal completing his cosmic temple within 7 days. We get the point. The readers or the hearers' minds, when finding out that the world was created in 7 days, would have been reminded of the building of the tabernacle or the temple. So now the garden stood on a mountain in the midst of Eden. Eden is a high mountain garden? Well, yes. This is how it's been read actually by Jewish and Christian readers for thousands of years. So where in the Bible is Eden described this way, as a mountain? Well, in Genesis 2, 8 through 14, we read of Eden as a region in which God plants a garden. And a single river flows out of the garden, then splits into 4 heads. This detail is actually pretty explicit. Eden is the source of the rivers of the earth, and water flows downhill, which clearly means that Eden is on top of a high place. And the prophets, Mount Zion, which is the mountain in which the Jewish temple actually sat, is often, and it's often symbolic for Jerusalem, is consistently described in analogy with Eden. Ezekiel 28, 13 through 14 recalls Eden, the garden of God, as the holy mountain of God. And Joel 2, 1 through 3 talks of Zion, my holy mountain, and its surrounding land is described like the Garden of Eden. When later biblical authors envision the New Jerusalem mountain, they describe it in Eden imagery. Isaiah 11, 1 through 9 shows that the Messianic king will rule over the New Jerusalem, where the animals will be at peace, as in Eden. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. In Ezekiel 41 through 2, Ezekiel sees the New Jerusalem, which is on a very high mountain. In Ezekiel 47, the temple has a new Eden River pouring out its doors, bringing life into new creation. In Revelation 21 through 22, we see the new heavens and the new earth, or the renewed earth. It's also a new temple and a new Jerusalem, which is a place on a high mountain, and described with the Eden imagery, the river of life, the tree of life, and so on. So the land surrounding the garden flourished in material wealth. The kind of jewels within the surrounding land reminds us of the gilded clothing of the Israel's priest found in Exodus 28, 17 through 20. This might not be evident at first glance when comparing Genesis and Exodus. After all, Genesis only mentions 3 precious items, and Exodus mentions 13. But if we turn to Ezekiel 28:13, we see another example of Eden. A description of Eden and its precious minerals and jewels. We see that the parallels between Exodus 28, 17 through 20 and Ezekiel 28, 13 are almost exact. You can see that here. So in the Ezekiel passage, we can actually see that it's missing 3 of the jewels or minerals, but nevertheless, we see the parallels, and it's supposed to remind the hearers of the priests. And into this primordial temple, God places his priest, Adam and Eve. God placed Adam into the garden to work it and to keep it, or we could say to serve and guard it. Now, this particular word pair, serve and guard, appears elsewhere in the Pentateuch, that Pentateuch being the first 5 books of the Bible. And it's used to describe the priestly duties of working and guarding the temple. So Numbers 3:8 says this, and they shall guard all the furnishings of the tent of meeting and guard the sons of Israel as they serve the tabernacle. So it seems rather clear that Moses intends for readers to pick up on the fullness of this temple language used within Genesis 1 and 2. Adam and Eve were priests in this primordial temple garden within the Garden of Eden. So did they have the responsibility to worship God in the temple garden? Well, absolutely. But it appears they not only worshiped God by fellowshipping with him, but by imaging him, what theologians call the imago Dei. So what exactly does it mean to be made in the image of God? Some have thought that it means that we actually look like God. I don't believe this to be the case. Anytime that the Bible uses human features to describe God the Father, it's using anthropomorphic language to help the reader or hearer begin to comprehend the infiniteness of God. After all, in John 4, it says that God is spirit. Some think that being made in God's image is because human are rational. We're creative. We have this moral compass, being able to tell right from wrong. It is true that we do have all three of these characteristics that do reflect the characteristics of God. But we are not the only ones who are rational, creative, moral. The angels and demons and even the devil are all rational, creative, and have the ability to know right from wrong. So what exactly does it mean to be created in the image of God? Well, I believe it actually means three things. First, we are meant for a relationship with God. So out of all of God's creatures that he created, we are the ones made for a direct, intimate relationship with him. So for example, my dog, Olive. Like most dogs, she's very relational, much more than cats, am I right? She, however, has a genetic wiring to do certain things, mainly eat, sleep. Sometimes she does the zoomies around the house. She, however, was not wired for an intimate relationship with God. That's not in her genetic programming. Is it, Olive? Yeah, okay. Humanity was the pinnacle of God's creation, and we are all wired for intimacy with God. Here you go, Olive. Next, we are meant to be stewards and caretakers of God's creation. Basically, God left us in charge. As I mentioned earlier, God placed Adam into the garden to work it or serve it, to keep it, to guard it, found in Genesis 2:15. This can also be found in Genesis 1:28, what is called the cultural mandate. It says, "And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." The first part of this mandate, which is be fruitful and multiply, is something humans are pretty good at, maybe a little too good at. This is actually pretty important, though, because like God, we have the ability to willingly create life. The second part, have dominion, gives us direct authority over creation. Take that and add Genesis 2:15 to it, and we are supposed to have dominion, to work or serve and guard all aspects of what God made in those 6 days of creation. This not only includes taking care of other people and loving our neighbors as we love ourselves, but also taking care of animals and taking care of the earth itself. We are called to be stewards of this world, and we must take care of it, something that I would say we haven't done a great job of. Lastly, we are called to be representatives of God. So let's go back to the Garden of Eden / temple motif. At the end of temple construction in the ancient Near East was when a ruler would place an image bearer of their local god or gods, typically an idol of stone, wood, or metal. And on the 6th day of God's creation, we see that he too places his image bearers into his cosmic temple. In the Genesis account, however, we see that God's image bearer is not a statue of stone or wood or gold, but a man and woman made from dust. They are created in God's image outside of the garden and then placed into the garden. In Genesis 1:26 through 28, we learn that God created Adam and Eve in his image. Now, the Hebrew word translated for image is tselem. This is not a bad translation because tselem can mean image or likeness. It is, however, not the full definition. Tselem actually means idol. This translation usually makes us a bit uncomfortable because of what idols are associated with. Idol is not a bad translation, though. So wait, Andy, are you trying to say that humans are created as the idol of God? Well, just listen and stick with me for a little bit. We have a tendency to think of idols as gold or stone statues, kind of like this. Statues that are lifeless and were the actual gods themselves. That people believe that this little fertility statue that Indiana Jones was trying to take was the actual god, but this is actually a misconception. We have to realize that an idol was not a god, but a statue used to represent a god. If I go outside of PNC Park here in Pittsburgh, I see a statue of Roberto Clemente. Now, this statue is not obviously Clemente in the flesh, but a mere representation of Clemente and a reminder of what he did for the Pittsburgh Pirates, for baseball in general, for the city of Pittsburgh. So idols served the same function as a representation of a god and what they symbolize. Some of you may be confused. What about a verse like Leviticus 19:4? Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. This might confuse us because it seems like the metal statue is a god. And what the author, Moses, is trying to say here in Leviticus is not that the statue itself is a god or a false god, but that there is no real god behind the statue. It's symbolizing, it's representing nothing, and therefore you are merely worshiping lifeless metal or nothing. There are very similar thoughts to image bearing in ancient Greco-Roman culture. The Greek equivalent of tselem is icon. It's where we get the word icon or iconography from. Now, Matthew 22, the Pharisees are trying to entrap Jesus for treason and ask him the question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus responds by asking to see a coin used for taxes and poses the question, whose likeness and inscription is on this coin? Or in other words, whose icon is on the coin? Who does this coin represent? So God creates us, the image or idol of God, and this merely means that we are God's representatives. We should note that in this case, that humans, the image of God, are not the ones to be worshipped, though if we're honest with ourselves, we love to be worshipped. No, we merely represent God, and we point to the one who is worthy of worship, the one true God, Yahweh. We must remember that when God created humanity in his image as an idol, it was in the truest and purest form and not in the distorted, wicked, lifeless form that we define it as today. God's decision to bring humanity into existence was not an afterthought. Rather, it was his final and climactic act, making humanity the apogee of creation. Genesis 1:26 begins with God decreeing, "Let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness." God chose not to make himself represented with wood or stone or gold, but rather with a human being, with life, the very life that was breathed into Adam. No other creature was created this way. But as the story goes, and as we'll study more next week, God exiles Adam and Eve from the garden temple because they failed to guard from the infiltration of the serpent and failed to image God by their actions as they broke their fellowship with God by eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God's image filled the original temple through Adam and Eve. When they worked and guarded the garden, their faces showed the glory of God, and anyone could easily see the face of God behind their obedient faithfulness to him. But the fall changed all of that. They committed the first act of idolatry in history by their failures to guard the garden from the serpent and to keep God's temple holy by imaging God through their faithful relationship with him. Yet we, even after the fall, we are still created in God's image. We're just not quite sure what or who we're supposed to represent anymore. It's distorted, but it's not lost. Genesis 9:6 says this, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." This verse is actually talking about why murder is so heinous, because we are destroying God's very image. Now, it should be noted that these verses take place after the fall, so this still affirms that what we were created to do. And even though humanity is sinful, there is still enough likeness in God remaining in us. Man is still in God's image. However, since humanity has sinned, we are not fully as representative of God as we were before. Our moral purity has been lost, and our sinful character does not reflect God's holiness. Our intellect is corrupted by lies and misunderstanding. Our speech no longer glorifies God. Our relationships are now governed by selfishness rather than love. Yet here we are, the image of God. And this is where Jesus Christ comes in. Though we cannot fully represent God as we once did, he can. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says this, "In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image, the icon, the tselem of God." Colossians 1:13 through 15 says this, "He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption and forgiveness of sins." He is the image, the icon, the tselem of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Jesus Christ is the perfect representation of God. because he is God. Therefore, he could do what we failed at doing.